What's up, everybody? Welcome to AROYA Office Hours, episode 133. I'm Cian, and this is Jason, our resident cultivation expert for the day. This is your place for free cultivation education. Just want to give a free shout out today. This QR code on the screen is a free ebook from our industry expert, Jack Whipple. His crop steering super system's been proven across millions of square feet of canopy over 12 years. Scan the QR code now to download and start transforming your yields today. Also, want to give a quick shout out to an event happening tonight. The Connect community event is happening. It's called Foliar Focus and Trim Demo, happening this evening in Sacramento at Indoor Sun Hydro. Both Seth and I will be attending. So come join us and say hi in person if you're able to attend. It's going to be something you can RSVP to through the connect.community. You can find that by searching the name Foliar Focus Trim Demo or by Connect Community through Google. You find it on the first link. Also want to give a quick thanks to everyone today tuning in, our live viewers on YouTube as well as Instagram. Please let us know in the comments today where you're watching. We always like to know who's out there on what platform. Don't forget to give us a like and then tell your friends about Office Hours Live. And as always, please help leave us a review. It really helps out, gives us an idea of how we're doing and what you guys want us to cover. All right. Well, I had a question down in here today that I was looking at that, we've kind of touched on the idea of how to plan out what you want out of a facility. And I thought this question was something that you would find fun as well, Jason. IG Grown by John D says, working on a new facility build out. Curious about your thoughts on vegging in place versus having dedicated veg rooms. Anything that comes to mind that I might not be considering while I plan this out?
Yeah. So, I guess there's really two paths here, and I'll try and hit on some of the positive, negatives, liabilities, efficiencies of both processes. The bulk of places that I see, they've got a dedicated mom room, they've got some dedicated bedrooms, and then the dedicated flower rooms. Nice things here being that if you have moms, you have a little bit of redundancy. You have a little bit of a safety net. If you are only using flower moms or flower rooms and you're cutting clones off your actual production plants, that would be kind of the other route, right? So typically there's kind of two pathways here. Obviously, the other one being if you purchase your clones or you purchase your veg plants. May not get into that too much. I think it's pretty obvious there, but if we are cutting our clones off of our production plants, if we mislabel things, if we go into bad counts, if we have a health issue, it's kind of we really only get that one chance to make the clones effective, correct, healthy. And even then, you may want to have a bedroom or not. So I guess I didn't break this down as cleanly and organized as I could have. But so dedicated bedrooms, obviously, in that case, it's going to be a veg room, usually where we have multiple stages of veggies. So if we let's take an 8 flower room facility, for example, right? We're going to typically, an 8 flower room facility might be doing like harvesting 2 rooms at a time. That'd be kind of a pretty typical approach for that size of facility. Obviously, there's lots of facilities way larger than that. I work with a site that's got 50 plus flower rooms. They're harvesting every day. But let's just use this 8 flower room as an example. We're going to have stages of different plants in that veg room. So, one of the challenges there is obviously it's always going to be difficult for us to do any sterilization and maintenance in our veg room. Our veg room always has living plants in it. The advantages there being that we can pretty much, always optimize that environment for more vegetative growth. A lot of times we can actually, if we've got sliding benches, maybe we'll even have our light intensity move through that room. Sometimes we got to move plants across that room, but we can kind of set up a process that's dedicated for that phase in the life cycle. Advantages of vegging in your flower room. Obviously, our rooting in period is going to be a tad bit easier because we don't necessarily have to phase that into a specific part of our workflow. If we want to get into slabs earlier on, right? We can root into slabs on an 18-hour life cycle or light cycle there, and maybe get kind of a head start on our flower cycle. So we have a tad bit more flexibility as far as our plant life cycle timeline if we veg in the flower room, possibly a little bit less logistics labor. And then, we also get a veg in a clean room because we're going to probably be sterilizing that. Well, you should be sterilizing. I shouldn't say probably. Sterilize your room between each run. Get that thing nice and cleaned up, and any of the pathogens that we're worried about can get rid of them. So those are, some positives and negatives of vegging in your flower room. Obviously, I talked a little bit about also, the option of having moms, not having moms. If you have a really good source of vegging plants, and it's great because then you can put all of your energy, all your focus into the flower cycle of those plants. Most of the clients that I work with, it's not very often that I talk to people that are super happy with the quality of veg plants that they're getting. It's too bad. Obviously, transportation is difficult, sourcing is difficult, and then people that are vegging their plants don't necessarily have the liability of how healthy those plants are. Right? They typically have a set price that they're selling these for. If they have one round with some type of infestation, the people that are flowering those plants are typically end up on the short end of the stick here. So usually it is a little bit better to control that aspect of your grow. If you have the ability to veg your own plants, take your own clones. Now, when you need to, improve the quality of that portion of the life cycle, then that's up to you, right? You're not in the, like I said, liability of someone else's process in order to really have a high quality, high output plant towards the end of this cycle. I'm sure I missed something. I went all over the place on that one, Cian.
Well, it was a bunch of great points you made there. One of the things that I was thinking about the whole time is that it really kind of depends on your scale, right? I know me personally doing small batch runs with very limited labor supply, going direct from clone into my final substrate is a really attractive option for me for several reasons. It, cuts down the amount of time I have to spend on moving plants into an intermediate substrate. It also has the advantage of allowing me to, kind of like you said, move into a light cycle that favors those clones moving into a flower flip a little bit easier, smoother, with less stress on the plants. However, I've also done it the other way for a long time, where I've had a dedicated veg room and a dedicated mom room. And I really kind of think it depends on what your ultimate goals are, right? Because at a certain point, you can look at the idea of having a dedicated veg room as this is one of the only ways to kind of set yourself up to be able to be in a relatively continuous harvest situation where you have, one of the rooms in your facility harvesting, and then ideally cutting down the dead time that room has to a bare minimum, so that you're able to have stock ready to transition into that next flower phase at the key moment you need it to be. That will ultimately allow you to drive, production to its highest efficiency. But one of the things that Jason touched on there that's really important to remember is that when you group all of those vegging plants into one room, like we're talking about, you do have the option for, a tougher time keeping that room sterilized and clean, because it's difficult to take it out of production to be able to get that room properly cleaned and sterilized, versus flower rooms, which are going to be getting, cleaned and sterilized at the end of each round. So there's definite considerations to the veg room strategy. Implementing a really regimented IPM strategy to those rooms is really helpful. And, making sure that, like Jason said, you're taking proper advantage of it by segmenting that room in such a way that you can have a plan for the different plants in the room, where they are and what stage of the life cycle they're in.
Yeah. I'm really glad you hit on that specifically as far as rooting in from different medias. Obviously, everyone's starting with the clone plug, and when we are in veg, we have the option of obviously going right into our final media or in a a medium between our vegging and our flower in the media there. So most of the time, we're talking about so clone plug, and if we're going directly into our final media, a lot of times we're looking at a Hugo. Maybe if we're in a multi-tier, if we've got shorter, smaller plants, anytime that obviously we grow bigger plants in a Hugo, it makes it a little bit more difficult to do crop steering. We have to go a little bit more vegetative simply because we're not matching the size of the substrate to the transpiration needs of the plant. We're going to go have bigger drybacks than we want as far as ideal crop steering goes for these plants. Then there's obviously the option of going into that medium-sized substrate, right? So the advantage is when we do direct from clone plug to final media, we only have one rooting in process, right? And when we're rooting in, we kind of have to play with irrigation. It's not necessarily ideal for plant growth. We're trying to optimize that root penetration into the new substrate, and so it's a little bit tricky time. So the advantage, obviously, of going directly into the final media, a little bit less labor, a little bit less media cost, possibly depending on what you're selecting. And then obviously the only having to deal with rooting in process once. If we have an intermediate, still can't figure it out, medium substrate during our veg phase, advantages there being that a little easier to control our drybacks, right? So an example there would be, 4x4x3 before we go on to slabs. This is a great solution for larger plants. Let's say we're growing 5.5, 6 foot plants in our flower rooms. The reason being there is we can accelerate our plant growth a little bit by having good control over our water content during that. It's a little bit easier to do rooting in. Occasionally I've run into some clients who are actually trying to go from a clone plug to a 2-gallon Coco. That's definitely going to be some of the more trickier times to control your irrigations. If we are going into, let's say, a 4x4 mesh bag before we go into a 2-gallon Coco, it's going to give us a little bit more control. A lot of it just comes down to logistics as well, right? If we're growing very large plants, obviously having a 2-gallon in our veg rooms is going to limit how many plants that we can get into that veg room. Might make it a little bit harder to control humidity, depending on your HVAC abilities, and then definitely going to make it more work in order to transfer those into your flower room. So that's kind of also another logistics concern or thought when we're dealing with flowering in your own room. How big are your plants? What size medias? How many times do we want to run in?
I think those are all great points. And I mean, there are things to really keep in the center of your mind when you're planning out a facility that you're building out from the ground up, because you have the opportunity to design that whatever way you want to when you're building it out, and to maximize, either one of those strategies, whether that's to, root directly into your final substrate or to move towards an intermediary substrate. Like Jason was saying, you get, the opportunity when you are first building that facility out to sort of plan it to be purpose built towards one of those two strategies. And, it really depends on a variety of factors like we've talked about, and which one of those strategies ultimately fits you. May come down to budgetary concerns. It may come down to logistics in your facility, or the size and shape the rooms that you have are, and how easy it is for you to manage having a dedicated veg room, or tight schedule changes. Or it may be more advantageous to you and the amount of labor that you have to be having a little bit more time in between the flower cycles by moving direct from clone to flower plant. It really depends on your specific situation. I know that's a lot of information, but I hope that helps answer the question a little bit.
Yeah, and maybe to break it down so that people can decide whether or investigate they're going one route or the other. Size of the in plant, right? If we're going into a big plant, we've got a slowly maturing plant. We're at a 70-day flower cycle, then you're probably going to end up wanting that intermediate size, end up in a larger media, right? If we're going to end up in a 1 gallon Coco bag, let's just pop that plum plug right in there, skip those steps. If we're going to have to be able to control a much larger plant, then let's think about getting enough substrate to it.
I think that's a great way to structure the thought process there. And just remember, outside of just that part of your grow, you also, when you're setting it up right off the start, have the opportunity to, help make that a little bit more purpose built towards a lot of the different strategies that you might want to employ later down the line. And one of the things that Jason said a while back that really stuck with me that I really like is, bigger conduit than you think you need. Just those little logistical pieces and parts that will help you down the road when and if you need to expand the capability set of some machinery or equipment you have. Little things like that can go a long way.
Yeah, especially on your dry room. Like I don't see it quite as much anymore, but God, it seems like every client we help crop steer, they'd end up with mold in their dry room because they're just like, all right, well, we got 20% more bud mass that we're hitting our dry rooms with, and we either started slightly under spec or right at spec for the crop load that we were bringing in there. And she's like, well, I mean, those are good problems. It's still a problem, but it's a good problem. Yeah.
Yep. And no, that is very common. I see a lot of people undershoot that dehumidification capacity, especially on dry rooms, just because they're used to a certain yield. And like you said, once you start pushing the boundaries of that, all of a sudden you're going to find the limitations of that HVAC system really quickly. All right. Well, we've got a bunch of questions, I think, to jump into here that are fun ones that I don't think we've covered yet. This one was one that caught my attention a little ways back in here. I'd love to see your response, Jason. It says, Daniel Rakowski gives us, hey guys, I have a strain that has pretty much built my reputation. I can't seem to make it not seed just a little bit, no matter how many runs I've done with it. Something in the room always goes to seed. Is this genetic? Because I've ran at multiple strains in the same room just fine, but always end up with one or two seeding out. I have the environment locked in and VPD is set very well. Only the irrigation side of things is not 100%, as I'm in a little bit too big of pots for the plants that I'm growing. Could that stress from stacking the EC too high be one of the reasons that I'm having issues going to seed?
Possibly. I wish we had a question or a picture with this question. There's kind of different stages of seed, right? And for most of the fully developed and reproductive seeds, there's going to be some amount of pollen, right? Some fertilization that goes on. When we see bananas, we see some herming. Maybe we just even see some of those small, early developed soft seeds inside way deep towards the inside of that bud. If you're getting fully developed seeds, then there's something pretty significant going on, right? If you already know that you're in too large a media and that's a concern, then see what you can do to just try a run with a little bit smaller media. This is also where I'd look at just kind of the general stressor factors, right? Because obviously it sounds like you're looking at substrate conditions. It's pretty easy to overlook some things that end up getting you, and that's why I love the data. There's a lot of times I grew a cycle and it's like, shit, what happened here? And then we can go back and look at the data, and obviously the data is only as strong as the sources of that information, right? And many a times that I've worked through a system where a sensor wasn't necessarily giving me the right data. So typically when I'm thinking about where to begin diagnosing this, obviously environmental issues, right? Am I rocking just one sensor? What's the quality of the sensor in that room? Is it reliable? Have I validated or verified it or calibrated it, recently? Environmental factors, I always like to talk about them first when I start a discussion with a new client, simply because one, they're unavoidable. They need to be in a pretty reasonably tight range in order to optimize your crop, right? Regardless of what we do with our irrigation, if our environment, our light and our CO2 parameters aren't pretty close to a good range, then it doesn't matter what we do with our irrigation and our substrate. We're still going to be leaving some on the table to be completely optimized. Yes, stressors do cause reproductive growth in the plant, right? So that's one of the reasons that sometimes we are leveraging the osmotic differential between the substrate and the plant, raising our EC so that we have less osmotic differential, try and induce the hormone balance in that plant to be more reproductive. Obviously, if going too far, then we're going to see things like reduced plant growth, possibly seed development. It might be one of those things where you just work on that genetic a little bit as well. Possibly, do some crosses with itself to see if we can't get rid of the genetic propensity of that strain to build those seeds or those seed pockets that you're talking about. So that's where I'd go. It wasn't necessarily a linear answer, right? It's just, let's re-examine, or if we do think it is a stressor, is it one that's not known of? Is it one that we know we're doing that we're pushing too far? Or is it possibly just something that, hey, this is going to happen with this specific cut? Let's try and get it out of the genetic, get it out of the breeding of that strain.
I love your answer, though, honestly, because it's kind of the same two boiled down things that my mind came to, which was, what's the genetics predisposition to create seed? How often are you seeing that? Is it happening in multiple other facilities with different conditions? And, if so, you can start to come to the at least partial conclusion or feel like you have a good direction in trying to solve for that genetic predisposition, kind of what Jason was saying, by, crossbreeding it back in with itself to try and help eliminate its predisposition to do that. The other big thing being, if a plant does have some genetic predisposition to go to seed, hitting really high EC levels in the substrate can definitely be one of those stressors that push you a little further across that line than you wanted to go. And, the other thing to take into consideration, are you getting any potential pollen into the room or greenhouse somehow? So a bunch of different factors there to consider when you're looking at those genetics that are going to seed. Looks like we had one more from Daniel Rakowski real quick. A little bit of a different subject, but since he put two in right at the same time, we'll give him another one here. He says, hey guys, love the AROYA crop steering section in the CCI Black Book. I'm learning so much. My question is regarding resetting a room for another run. What chemicals would you recommend after cleaning the room to disinfect and reset it? It'd be a bonus if this doesn't require a wipe down for me.
I personally, I like chlorine dioxide fumigation. It's probably one of the easier and maybe even more aggressive ways to get it done. So you'll want to protect any of the equipment that you have in there to some degree. Obviously, if you have anything that does like to corrode, some chlorine dioxide fume is going to make it corrode faster, and now it's time to get new hardware. So do think about, obviously, that there are some less aggressive ways. When we think about, wipe downs, not ideal. I like pressure washers personally. If you do feel like you need to put some type of sanitizing chemical or agent, a lot of pressure washers just have a dilution bin on them. So you can just fill that bad boy up at the dilution that you need to spray things down with. But for me, it's mostly, the pressure washers, debris removal, and keeping things nice and shiny and clean. So those are the specific ones that are my favorite. There's lots of good options out there though. So don't take that as, as the best necessarily.
I mean, I'll be honest, I'm right there with you though. The chlorine dioxide is my favorite sanitization method by far and away. I'm also a big fan every once in a while, especially if you got HPS, of kicking the temperature up, baking the room a little bit. That can definitely be another one of those great ways to help reduce potential vectors for disease in your room. And both don't require you to wipe down your walls. I will say, when you skip too many rounds wiping down your walls, it does look a little suspect when you walk into those rooms. You're like, why are the walls strange colors? So, for what it's worth, little presentation goes a long ways.
Bake it or freeze it. Up here in the Northwest, 2 weeks ago we were down at -8, and tell you what, there's not much that's gonna survive in there if you turn the heaters off in a greenhouse for a couple days, or even a few hours possibly.
That is a great point, Jason. Actually, next time I'm in a nice big cold swing, I might just leave the door open for a little while. Well, let's jump on to another one in here. I had another one that was kind of interesting to me a little further down. It was from one of our viewers a while back here, but I thought it was a fun question that kind of went along with our first one this morning this afternoon about rooting. This comes from Burn Tires, Burn Trees, and he's asking, do you guys think it's better to let clones root longer than plug, or plug as soon as you see roots starting to pop out of the bottom of the cube?
Yeah, great question. Again, I wish there was the exact right answer here. I think the right answer is, how big a media are you going into? So yeah, to tie it back to where we're at, obviously if I'm going from a clone plug to a 4x4, where I still have quite a bit of control over my water content. And again, round plug into a round hole, that's going to make a big difference as well. Even if we plug that when the hairs just start popping, we're going to see enough hydraulic continuity connectivity between that 4x4 and that clone plug to do a good job. Now, let's say I'm going from a clone plug into, maybe I don't have a choice, but I'm going into a 2-gallon Coco. I kind of took it to the far side here. I'm going to definitely want a little bit more amount of root maturity on there. When we're thinking of, all right, if I don't have good hydraulic connectivity, conductance between my new substrate and my clone plug, then the more exposed root that is there, the better chance that those root hairs are going to find water, seek out the new media, and really take hold.
I think that's a good way to judge it. How big of a plant are you trying to grow, and what media are you going into? Because a lot of times, like you said, if you're going straight into that 4x4, that next intermediate media, you should be able to go in there with you don't have to have finger length roots coming out of the bottom of your clone plug to be able to have that successfully root in on your 4x4. Meanwhile, going into a much bigger media, like Jason said, that may well help you root in faster and establish a healthier root system in that larger substrate, if that's what you've got to work with. Not necessarily an ideal situation going into that 2-gallon, but work with what you got.
Yeah, maybe we'll just hit up some general tips of ways to help rooting in happen quickly. We just hit the first one with that question there. Having good levels of dissolved oxygen, absolutely necessary. Right. Anytime that we see some amount of discoloration in those roots, you are not growing as quickly as you could. You don't have the health of dissolved oxygen in there. Those things should be pearly white. They should be whiter than your teeth, basically. So good levels of dissolved oxygen, making sure we don't hit water stagnation in any of our medias. All right. And so when we're thinking about that, that means we need some amount of fresh oxygen again, and nutrients. provided by an irrigation. And that's where, we were talking about that rooting in process being a little bit of a challenge, right? Because if I'm going from a clone plug to a 2-gallon Coco pot, I'm going to have a hell of a time doing that rooting in process simply because it's easier for me. The balance is going to be much harder to achieve perfectly where I'm not hitting root stagnation, but I am getting some amount of dryback so I can provide irrigations. And so it really kind of comes down to those processes. And then obviously appropriate light levels, environment.
I think that's a great set of instructions to think about how to get your clones to root in a little bit more quickly. One of the things that I always think about too is consistency and health of the cuttings from the plant, because I see time and time again, people will contact me and talk about, they've got some varietals that are, or some cultivars that are not rooting in as quickly as others, and that may well be a genetic predisposition for it to root in a little bit less quickly. But one thing I see really commonly too is people taking poor quality cuts that have less pith in the stem. And that's a really avoidable product or problem to have that you can cross off the list by just trying to monitor the quality and consistency of the cuts you're taking from the mom stock.
Yeah, great point. It's interesting because cloning is one of those processes where sure, you're timing it by how many clones did you cut in an hour. But the reality is that short amount of time is never going to make up the cost of a low quality cut. So absolute first place to start when you're starting or trying to improve a facility's consistency, when you're trying to improve plant uniformity, is making sure, are we detailed? Are we clean? Are we doing what Cian says as far as, making sure those cuts are healthy?
We have another question that came in from our friends here at North Fork Farms, not quite on the clone side of things, but ties in with our talk about, is it cleanly, is it clean? Are you guys being able to provide the environment that those plants need and want? They ask, hey guys, can we talk about the Western flower thrip? Can't seem to beat these guys. Tried pyrethrins and quadruple strength spinosad. Heard lots of growers are having similar issues with this level of persistence, shall we say, with the Western flower thrip.
Yeah. And I think I kind of do my 3-step process really when we think about dealing with bugs, and that is obviously plant health, facility cleanliness is probably the first one. Plant health is the next one. I not that it's going to fix it. Once we have that infestation, yeah, you're talking about trying to solve it. Really, ideally, the best thing that we can do is next round think about what are ways that we can help prevent this. Because as you are experiencing, it's pretty much almost impossible or way more difficult to eradicate it after an infestation. Much more energy goes into that than it does into helping reduce the chances of an infestation or the intensity of an infestation. So, obviously cleanliness of the facility, doing things that we talked about during a room flip, plant health, making sure that anytime that, we're getting significant amounts of dead material or old plant material, that we are doing a de-leaf or just periodically going up in there and cleaning it. Unhealthy plant material is the main food for this stuff. They would way rather chomp on some soggy cells, something that's a little bit easier for them to feast on than good healthy plants. I like a little bit of silica additive in early flower. That helps increase the cell wall density and thickness in our plants, and then helps just provide a natural defense. It's spinosad and pyrethrins are usually pretty good. Obviously, other options that you have there are, doing some type of predator on them as well.
I was going to mention predator bugs. The other thing that I was thinking of too is, the facilities that I've seen have major issues with thrips in the last year or two, and there have been quite a few, have had the most success by if they haven't gotten into your moms yet, religiously protect the health and the continuity of your genetics, and then try to systematically clean your facility from there. And I've had a lot of people tell me that that's a painstaking yet effective way to deal with this, so long as it hasn't gotten into your current mom stock. And unfortunately, like Jason said, pyrethrins are normally pretty effective. Spinosad is pretty effective by and large. So it's a difficult proposition to be able to make sure that you're actually effective in getting rid of those thrips, just because they can be a whole lot more difficult to, like Jason said, get rid of than prevent with good practices in the first place. Knowing that you have them, like I said, pay close attention to just how closely you're able to watch your mom room and your stock there to be able to try and protect against future generations in rooms moving that direction, along with whatever in your facility is currently experiencing the thrips infestation. Got one from a friend that's been posting in. His handle is Chief of Kiev. Hey guys, loving the show as always. Question for the team. Do you know if there are any negative effects we might see if we take our clone cuts off of our plants during week 1 of stretch and flower? We've been doing this for a while and getting decent results with no major issues. But with that said, you guys tend to have the expert opinion. I think we've heard a similar one before, but always worth touching on.
Yeah, I mean, if it's done well, it's a really great option to save some facility resources. Get yourself another flower room instead of a veg room, or mom's room. Excuse me. Downsides of that, just liability. The detriment of screwing something up with whether labeling or quantities or any of that stuff. Plant health in the in that room. It's just a little bit harder, I guess, is all I'm saying. If you do it right, no downsides.
I'd agree. I'd say, the times where I have seen downsides occur, generally speaking, timing is your biggest Achilles heel. If you are not paying attention to just how far into your flower cycle you're getting, then you're in re-veg territory, which is nobody's favorite place to be with a cultivar. So watch your timing carefully, but like Jason said, if it's done properly and done well, I mean, it can be a great way to decrease some of your resource consumption around your facility in certain ways. It can also be a great way to, if you don't have mom stock of those genetics ready to go, be able to get some, off of some currently growing cultivars. So, never be afraid to do it, but do pay attention to that timeline, because if you're starting to produce bud sites, you're potentially just a little too far along there. Well, I want to jump on to another one here that we had. Here it is. Hey, you guys think about starting to cut the lights down and cut the irrigations a week before, not cut them down, move them up, build your lights and irrigations a week before flip. I'm having the issue that the side branches are going wild and making a bunch of branches, which is very time consuming when big leafing. My plan of action is to go through and cut a bunch before veg. I think he's actually talking about potentially a de-leafing practice, or like a cutting out, now that I'm reading the question a little bit more thoroughly. So let's go with that a little bit. My plan of action is to cut, let's assume, plant matter, veg week 1, and start bulking 1 week before flipping. I wanted to see what your guys' opinion is on going a little bit deeper in the de-leafing. Yep, so it is de-leafing, so that I can not spend any time doing more of it later on in the round. We do 2-gallon Coco perlite 70-30.
I usually don't need to do a significant amount of deleafing in veg. If I am, usually it's a signifier that I could change some environmental parameters to try and help reduce how leggy and stretchy these plants are getting. So it shouldn't necessarily take a lot. As far as topping, anytime that I'm removing stems or plant material that is more significant than lower leaves, I try to avoid that personally. I spent energy, time, money, nutrients, all that stuff into growing biomass. I try to avoid cutting it off. As far as taking some of that leafy matter going into flowers, it's really one of the first times that I prefer to do it. But maybe my veg plants are smaller than he's used to.
Yeah, I was going to say I tend to try and not have quite as aggressive of a strategy, especially since starting to move towards under canopy lighting. I just don't have to take as much plant matter away from the bases and stems as I used to. So I try to really kind of avoid pulling too hard on it. For a long time, though, that was definitely a pretty effective strategy that a lot of people employed to try and train their plants into the growing space that they had. I've definitely seen people over the years be pretty aggressive with, early, like devegetation practices that have been pretty successful. I always kind of wonder, though, with the heavier practices, whether or not you're leaving a little bit of money on the table when you take that much of the plant matter so early on.
Yeah, and for me, the way I judge how much plant matter I need to take off is typically on what's the minimum amount necessary to maintain light levels and canopy uniformity. Deleafing is costly. If you're doing it yourself, it's probably not that much fun, and just, I guess, depending on who you are. But doing it at scale can take a significant amount of time.
Absolutely agree. Try to touch the plant as infrequently as possible. Well,
only when you want to.
Oh yeah, exactly. And always wear gloves. We got another live question that came in here from Keaton P. Says, what's y'all's take on no lights for the last 24 hours or even 48 hours to increase trichome and terpene production? I've seen it mostly with resin farmers, but I was curious on what your take would be.
I mean, sure, if you want to. I just don't necessarily prefer it myself. Maybe on my harvest day, I won't turn the lights on, mostly just for human comfort in there. Same thing with irrigation. Maybe I just won't irrigate the last, the actual harvest day. Up until then, I like to keep it running. If you do have some anecdotal or even scientific evidence that says, by cutting it out, we see some type of chemical or morphological improvement, then keep doing it. Personally, I haven't had that experience, and so that's how I roll.
I would say I'm in the same boat there. I haven't seen any hard evidence that says that produces any quality that I'm after in my final product. I've also, I've always been a little skeptical when I've heard people talk about, cutting your lights off, especially up to 48 hours, before you're actually harvesting your product. You're going to have a hard time getting your plants to transpire properly, first of all, when you kill your light source and you don't have normal day and night cycle through that time. So you're going to have to watch how much you're actually feeding and irrigating your plants through that period of time really, really carefully. And then the other thing that you want to consider there is photosynthesis is it needs light to happen. So at the end of the day, you cut off your light source. I don't necessarily personally feel as though ending its photosynthetic processes are allowing it to necessarily finish in a way that produces a better taste or terpene profile or a color, for example, that might sell for more money. Nothing that I've seen personally, at least. So to what Jason said there, if you have any anecdotal evidence or if you've got anything that you'd like to share with us that's a little more concrete from runs you've done that shows that that's working better, definitely. But if it's just kind of something that people have suggested, I would say, take into consideration what you might be leaving on the table doing that to the plants rather than allowing them to finish properly.
Yeah. And, one of the things that you might consider if you're doing a side-by-side trial as well is, rather than comparing it, lights off versus, lights on for the last 2 days, whatever, compare it with lights off versus chopping 2 days early, right? Because when we think about, all right, how long is that flower phase in days? Really, the plant's counting them by how many micromoles it gets, by how much light it gets, how often does it get to photosynthesize, right? So if we are seeing a higher quality out of running 2 days with lights off versus cutting it, 2 days early, hopefully you guys understand what I'm trying to say here. Then cool.
I think that's a pretty astute observation. If you need to, just a couple of days early, why not? Instead of trying to leave it like that. All right, I have another one in here. We'll finish this out for the day, I think. This one's from our friend Mighty Mouse. He's a regular commenter in here. How long does it take for plants to respond to aggressive drybacks? My levels dip just a little bit below 20% VWC after the lights first come on before irrigation hits, but it's only for about an hour or so. Is that enough to send generative cues to my plants, or is it too much?
Yeah, I wouldn't worry about being down there with Coco, obviously. If we're trying to push extremely generative, yeah, we get down under 20%. That's at the point where we actually are starting to send a little bit of drought signals to the plant. So when we think about, all right, how does the plant know? How does it know anything about water? Right, it doesn't know water content. It knows how much vacuum does its roots have to apply in order to pull water out of that substrate. And when we're working with Coco, we can talk about Rockwool here in a minute too if we want. But assuming the question is related to Coco, because it makes it a lot more fun to answer. When we look at a curve of matric potential, which is the amount of vacuum the roots have to apply to get water out of there, versus volumetric water content in Coco, or these graphs are going to change just a little bit when we're working with a perlite blend or any type of specific Coco versus another. But if we generalize Coco, it actually has a little bit of an elbow, and that elbow typically we see a matric potential starts to be present between about 15 and 25%. Usually I think about, all right, when I hit 15% water content, that plant is getting a signal from the amount of water content in there, that it's getting to the point where it can actually feel the vacuum increase, right? So, and forgive me, I didn't bring my laptop today, but let's go. VWC. Nope. VWC, and then I think this is going to be negative kilopascals kPa. Right? I don't know if my scaling is going to be very good here, but let's say, yeah, let's get a better scale. Let's go like this. There we go. All right. So, jumping into the fun soil sciences of this stuff and hydroponic growing. One of the reasons hydroponic growing is nice is because most of the time we can fluctuate EC levels to play with osmotic differential to start cueing this plant. Now, when we get down to say, under 20%, that's where this elbow starts to kick in with Coco. And like I says, this is kind of a rough drawing. But basically what's happening is, anywhere in, we'll use some other, let's get some, anywhere in this section, the vacuum that has to be applied by these plants is insignificant to pull water out of hydroponic media like Coco. Right? It really can't tell the difference in this range of necessary vacuum of matrix potential. Now, let's say in this range here, we can see, all right, when we drop below, say 20% water content or down to 15% water content, that the steepness of the curve changes a lot, right? So let's say we went from, had 20% to 15%. We can see that actually represents a much more significant difference in necessary vacuum, right? And so even though here, our level of vacuum isn't changing much, say between 20 and 80% water content. If your Coco can hold that, if it only holds 45, then we're talking between 20 and 45. Yeah, so that's kind of explaining, all right, well, sure, when you get down there for an hour, it's probably not doing much. If we get down there, say we hit 10% for 3 hours, you're definitely going to be sending, some type of drought response to this plant.
I think that's a more scientific way than I've ever seen it explained to most people. But yeah, that's the principle, the concept there is that the lower you get in volumetric water content, the more vacuum that plant has to apply to the root system to be able to pull water up through. And that is the stress essentially that you are putting on the plant. And the further along that trend line that Jason was showing you, there you go, the further you've increased the stress on that plant. And that's what we're using to try and push it towards the reproductive life cycle change. And I think, realistically 20%, assuming, Coco, sounds perfect. Sounds like you're right on point with that.
Yeah, anyone who's seen very many episodes of this know I'm always very careful around the word stress because I think a lot of times it's misused, right? As far as when I'm looking at data points, it's going to be very difficult to talk about what is stress. When we are assessing stress, the plant is the only thing that can assess what stress is, right? And if we are seeing temporary wilting point, they're probably just starting to get in there. If we're seeing permanent wilting point, yeah, some parameter has caused a significant event to have some damage, right? So that's that can be used a little bit for manipulating plant growth. Temporary wilting point is sometimes an effective way of increasing chemical potencies of some stuff. Sometimes you can also do it at the right time in order to get a little bit higher metabolism in the plant. That's kind of starting to get at the edge of crop steering, where it's like, all right, we're using the plant we're using crop steering just to manipulate the variables to swing hormone balances and swing morphology and plant growth. When you start playing around with significant stressors, plants, elements that cause that plant stress visually, then you're pushing the edge, and it can be helpful in certain strains and certain amounts of application and intensity, and sometimes it can be detrimental. So
I think that's a really good thing to kind of point out, is that there is a big difference between visual stress symbols that the plant is showing you that it is stressed out, like temporary wilting point when you're getting into that, and what we talk about when we say creating a stressful environment for the root zone by kind of edging it along that vacuum curve that you were talking about. Because there's definitely a difference there, creating an environment that the root system is pulling harder vacuum in there can be, just like you said, something that helps to really move our plants in the right direction. Or, if you are really getting into that temporary wilting point, there are some cultivars out there that can really have positive beneficial effects from that. However, I would say it's a marginal effects the further you get along that curve as you start to get further into temporary wilting.
Yeah, and if we want to talk about the Coco side of this, to break it down simply, if you're spending much time that low in Rockwool, you're probably wasting Rockwool. You're going to have some real challenges getting back up to resaturation. The only time that I'm comfortable spending many hours under, say, 30%, 35% Rockwool is right towards the end. Or it's like, I'm throwing this Rockwool out anyways. I can't keep my water capacity up. Not the end of the world. Now, if I'm in week 3 in a Hugo and I keep hitting 10% water content, it's going to be a challenge to wrap up some of those generative cues in the plant, simply because I'm going to have to irrigate at least all of the light hours and possibly into the dark hours,
just to be able to keep it wet. Yeah. I mean, I talk to people constantly about that. If you're dumping that field capacity on your Rockwool early on, like you said, that's going to be a long, painful road of trying to keep enough water moving through that substrate that you're able to just, allow it to survive every day. You're not really going to be able to steer it towards a more successful outcome at that point. So, when we do say 20%, definitely realize we are talking about Coco, because we don't necessarily want to see you spend all that much time down in that range in Rockwool substrates. Well, I think it's probably about time for us to wrap up for the day, everybody. Thank everyone for tuning in today. We, as always, love all the cultivation questions, guys. Keep the live questions coming. Drop them in anytime in the AROYA app. Email us at sales@aroya.io. DM us via Instagram, Facebook, LinkedIn. We want to hear from you guys. Use this QR code here today to download a free copy of that CCI book. It's a great resource for anyone learning how crop steering works, or to just be able to reference in your grow day to day. As I said earlier, Seth and I are going to be at a connected event tonight in Sacramento, sponsored by Powerhouse, the people with great shirt Jason's got on today. And we'll be down there. So come out if you're able to come down and meet us. There's going to be a bunch of wonderful educational talks from experts in the field. And thank you everyone that came in and tuned in live today. Want to make sure you guys keep coming in. Please leave us reviews on Spotify, Apple Music, YouTube, wherever you're listening to the podcast. And if you'd like to have specific topics come up, please drop them into the comments and into our feed. Thanks, everybody, and we'll see you guys all on episode 134.